Yeah, you're welcome. In the last study, we were looking at structuralism as something coming from a study from the background of linguistics. I told us about the scholar normally associated with that first move, Ferdinando Saussure, and then we began to talk about what he considered as sign, as the sign system, and how he began to use linguistic paradigms, linguistic codes, linguistic tools to do his own analysis of literature as a critical event. Now, the last time we stopped at looking at elements of the syntagmatic relation of signs that allows us to find a relationship, a common relationship that flows, a kind of correspondence of relation of signs on an horizontal axis. Okay, that allows us, for example, to see how phrases are formed and how they make meaning, to see how sentences are formed, to see the relationship between the nominal, that is the noun element, with the verbal element, with the object, and then we also understand how these have a lot of ways they give us the surface meanings of language on the plane of literature. But then, this correspondence of signs on the horizontal also give us what we call a way of looking at the sign correspondence, in structuralism, as having another orbit, another frame of looking at relations. We have what we call the paradigmatic relation of signs, the associative relations of signs, which also allow us to begin to understand the function of a particular sign as related to the meaning it is given in society as different from the meaning given to other signs in society. For example, if you say he lives in a mansion, the mental understanding of the word mansion makes us to know that, number one, we are talking about a habitation. We are talking about a place where definitely human beings live. Of course, the mansion gives you the idea of not just any kind of habitation or residence. It's giving us a class of residents. But then you can't understand mansion as a meaning of habitation if you cannot relate it to a word like home or a word like other forms of habitations like a hut or a house or even say a hostel. So within that situation, we are able to understand the particular meaning of a sign like mansion, as a sign that has a meaning relationship with other signs within its own kind of element of habitation, like hut, hostel, a room, a house, and so on and so forth. But then, on the paradigmatic level, you are also seeing what we can talk about in terms of a differential relation. Differential relations happen in language. Differential relations give us ideas of the fact that a sign means something that is consigned to it as being different from what another sign means. For example, by saying that I love eating cake, it's by extension not saying I love eating bread. The relation of meaning that we impute on cake is based on a dietary imaginary. But then, in that dietary imaginary, we are specific about a particular sign as different from another. So we have differential relations of signs, so that when we are positing signs within the sign system, the dialogue of meaning making is hinged on the syntagmatic and paradigmatic relation of signs, not in particular separate ways, but in ways in which they strangely or they, in a very complex way, make immediate meanings that are framed within microseconds, so to speak. So that when you say this is a boy, You are by extension not saying this is a girl, which will be a very, very differential relation in terms of sex and in terms of age group. And within the associative relation of the male signifier, which is human in this sense, you are not by extension saying this is a man. You are not referring to a man. And then when we begin to bring in adjectivals like this is a fair boy, this is a black boy, this is a white boy, and things of that nature, we are saying things that have to do with specific meaning making. So what Ferdinand de Saussure began to conceptualize in structuralism was to make us able to pull out certain elements within language, and in this context, in terms of literary meaning, that will be standing in relation with other elements within literature. At certain levels, I'll be explaining very much soon, that was even better developed by another, well, I wouldn't say better in the sense of quality. I'm saying better in the sense of progression, okay? Better developed by a critic called Roland Barthes. Now, the relationships of signs within text are associative, okay? They're in correspondences, they're in associations, and definitely they are in, differential relations. That makes you to identify things, okay? This is different from this, but it relates with this element and relates with that element to make a particular meaning that is created within us. Now, there are some very important work that came up from Saussurean structuralism that diverge into some other fields, okay, that constitute the peculiar language of the field this has to deal with. For example, Saussurean structuralism informed anthropological structuralism as developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss, okay, another Frenchman who was looking at traditional societies that deal with myth and how myth and the elements of this traditional, well, we might even say anthropological communities, how the elements of those communities can be analyzed, made sense of, and put in structures that posit them as peculiar and different from other particular sign systems. Okay, now it also had impact on Vladimir Prof. You must have heard that name when we were looking at Russian formalism. A number of these formalisms coming from Russia also were participants in structuralism, okay, in their later developments. People like Vladimir Prof, for example, Roman Jakobson, they also had their own investments in structuralism. We also have people like A.J. Grimers, perhaps the person that is most known today when we talk about structuralist criticism of literature is Roland Barthes. But then we also have Charles Sanders Peirce, who is seen as the arrowhead of another, well, semiological field. Remember, I told us semiology is the science of signs. And when we talk about semiology, we are talking about how we could look at sign systems in various sign projections. I've told us about that. Now, and by the way, both a scholar like Saussure and Roland Barthes, and indeed every structuralist scholar, will tell you that structuralism is a very integral part of semiology. A very integral part of semiology. Let me go on fast so that we will take certain elements out of what we're trying to do here. Now, in structuralist criticism, coming to Roland Barthes' explications now, we will see that there is a way in which we could begin to read genres like poetry, like prose fiction, okay, like drama, in specific frames of structures that make them to be very, very unique as coherent in the way they project their information, the way they say a number of things they are saying, but all this coming from the interior aspects of, the literature itself. In fact, structuralism, listen to this language, because you'll notice that as you read books in theory, you'll be definitely coming across ways of speaking, academic, scholarly language that themselves are signs of the fact that what you are dealing with have to do with academics. So these are some of the obvious codes, obvious signs you will see that are giving us the area of academic discourse. Now, you will find out that there are some words you'll be coming across that will be very helpful in dealing with texts, in dealing with even your activity of criticism and of making sense, even very path-breaking critical sense, just like these scholars have been doing, okay, in your own particular readings. Now, in structuralism, somebody like Roland Barthes will tell you that structuralism has to do with the interiority of the text. That is, we are looking at the issues, the elements, okay, the components that inform the literariness of the text in itself, not as something produced by culture or by an author or by a particular kind of exterior ideology coming from maybe politics or coming from the environment or coming from some other fields, but structuralism looks at literature as an interiority phenomenon. So it is concerned with the linguistic elements and the elements of discourse, that is, the ways in which the grouping of language within that particular text creates meanings that can be related to other sign systems like politics, economy, fashion, religion, and so on and so forth. So when we take this kind of approach, we'll begin to understand the fact that certain ways we speak, interiority, exteriority codes, and all that, talking about textuality and so on. We hear more of this as the lectures go on. They are things that we also ought to arm ourselves with to be able to make ready sense of, what we are reading or what we are doing, and also to be able to do our own very independent readings that can someday be very path-breaking. Now, coming to Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes, just in a way like Saussure, was actually coming from a background that was consistently, number one, antagonizing the bourgeois pretensions. Remember the word bourgeois, it had the beginning meanings, the etymology, within a class structure of a particular French society before the French Revolution in the 18th century. Okay, the bourgeoisie happened to be, you can say, the second in cadre class within that society, just after the aristocracy and just before the masses. But then later meanings will give bourgeoisie as an elite class that, of course, tends to cut the short, so to speak, within society, have influence in politics, how things happen and all that. So Roland Barthes was actually part of the leftist scholars. When you say some people or a person is leftist, you are saying that they are not the usual scholars you meet. They are scholars taking a particular rigorous and radical difference from what had been happening before. So Roland Barthes was part of a cream of leftist scholars that were really trying to subvert the high-handedness or the imperial sway of this class within France. He himself was a student of another fantastic French scholar called Jean-Paul Sartre, who is associated with the school of existentialism. Well, existentialism was a school that was taking a particular difference, taking a particular objection to the mainstream circulation of the idea of essence as normalized in the French society of that time. Of course, governed by bourgeois, governmentality. We'll come to this these titles later. Visual governmentality, okay, and how this becomes normalized in the sense of people. So for human essence, which was always seen as given, okay, something that was coordinated and something that must be realized as bringing everybody together, despite the class divisions among the people, despite the fact that some people suffer and some other people, enjoy. Such was in the flow of existentialism, which talks more about the liberty of human existence, of the individual existence, and the right of the human being to make choices, but also with the implications of the choices that individual makes. In other words, it was like democratizing the idea of essence so that actual people, actual identities could claim their own rights within the function of society. Okay, so Roland Barthes came out from such cream of scholars, Jean-Paul Sartre, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and the like, even Saussure himself, and the like, and all that. And they began to face, what they felt was the high-handedness of how society was being run. But Barthes also goes a bit further in beginning to subvert the reign of what was seen as academic criticism, which was seen as a kind of criticism that dealt with traditionalisms, how the author and experience can be found within text, explanation of the text by bringing it in relation to particular people and particular ways of the way they looked at things, okay, in producing great literature. But then the people that were often registered within this kind of critical gaze were definitely from the bourgeoisie class. So that one of the problems Roland Barthes had with the French academy was the fact that it was saturated with bourgeoisie ideas of reasoning, of positing the world, of reading text, of critiquing, and things of that nature. But his own inflection, his own, intervention in this kind of French scholarship was to be perceived as a kind of, it was an interventionist regime of reading things within the academy, but also a kind of progressive, so to speak, a radical progressive wing of advancing the academy. In fact, there was a particular problem which made Roland Barthes very much as significant then, okay, between a scholar called Raymond Picard and himself. Picard was saying what Roland Barthes was doing as something that was pedestrian. It was not taking the idea of deep reading, okay, into consideration. It was rather a kind of breaking the elements of literature into slices, okay, of what you may call mechanistic reading, a way of looking at things mechanically, okay, or mechanically, but then not actually giving us the elements within that literature. So that running battle was going on, but it really advanced the cause of Roland Barthes' structuralist reading of literature. But then, Roland Barthes is not alone in this. He had gained from scholars like A.J. Grimers. He had gained from people like Vladimir Prop. I'm coming to some elements of those gains later. He had gained from Claude Lévi-Strauss, gained from Saussure and all that, and he brought these things out. Now, a basic intervention that Roland Barthes does in structuralist readings of literature comes with his own criticism of narratives. For Barthes, he sees the narrative as an outpour of language, but definitely operating within the long. Remember, I told us that the idea of the long is language as a system. The long talks about language minus speech, minus talk, minus tales. What that means is that speech, like literature, benefits from the system that allows it to produce meaning. Therefore, what matters the most is understanding the system and create the meaning from that, the coordination of codes, of signs within that system before we can understand the parole called literature. So, in dealing with the narrative, for example, Roland Barthes takes certain steps. Number one, he sees the narrative of consisting of three basic elements of language in function. Number one, he sees it as a product of function. He sees it, the function of grammar. He sees it as a product of action. And then he sees the coordinates of this as what we consume as narrative. By function, he looked at two kinds of functions. Function is what allows us to make sense of the initial production of language and the initial meanings, like in the sentence, okay? And then within the functional production of language as a unit, it talks about the distributive function and the indices. By distributive function, it looks at a cause and effect relation in literature. For example, if somebody slaps somebody within a literature that is permeated, that is saturated by a discourse of justice, you know that there is one of two things that will naturally follow as effects. Number one, if there is a violation, if there is a crime in that kind of literature, the effect, that is the cause, the effect will be either justice or a deviance from justice, okay, injustice. And then there will be elements that make us see this kind of distributive function. You will find them within a number of locales within the novel or within the prose fiction. So we have distributive functions in narratives that allow us to understand, for example, the issue of cause and effect. When we progress that within narrative, we can talk about the initial understanding, okay, of the plot structure. The initial understanding of the plot structure. Now, the second element of function, it calls the indices, the realm of the indices within the meaning making of functions. Indices are indicators that give us ideas of what is really embedded in text. For example, in characterization or when talking about the setting, there are certain things that will describe the elements or the issue you are talking about. For example, if we're talking about a character, let's say this character is a radical, somebody that is a nonconformist. Indices like objective, indices like fighter, indices like troublemaker, and so on and so forth will be painting the picture of this radical. Now, if we go ahead and say that this character is middle-aged, or we say that this character is a young lady with a colored pigmentation, black, so to speak, pigmentation, and then you put that kind of character within a kind of a situation where some other elements within the story make her to be in contention with certain indices that are represented in grammar describing the society. A society described as, for example, conventional, traditional, patriarchal, and so on and so forth. You will get the immediate understanding by taking those grammatical elements in their units that you are running into a prose fiction that is definitely talking about some trouble within society, okay, about struggle as well. You are also dealing with a society that might also be read in terms of gender elements that doesn't favor well the female body, woman, girl, and all that. And you are probably also going to be seeing things that will make us progressively go into the story by more associations of indices related to this initial character. Now, let's go on a little bit further. We may also say that in describing society, getting to know the society we are dealing with, number one, some of the indices might be giving us words that have time orientation. For example, you could be talking about the traditional times, we're talking about the late 18th century Akan community, the Ghanaian society, you will discover that with this kind of signs associated with the description, of course, those descriptions too are words, remember, associated with the description of society is definitely not telling you, when you talk about the Himalayas, definitely not telling you something happening in Africa. It's definitely not. So in a way, if you are doing a structuralist criticism of narrative, you have got to line up those signifying elements, okay, that are in words or in phrases, groups of words or chunks of discourses, and in association with some other elements within the prose fiction, okay, you find certain elements that depict that novel or that prose fiction within the line of particular subject matter and thematic preoccupations. Now, Roland Barthes also gains, I told us, he gained from a number of people. One of the things he gained in reading narrative structurally also comes from Vladimir Prop. I've talked about Vladimir Prop a number of times, okay? And in that situation, we hear things like sequence. A sequence will tell us about the progression of certain elements we can find within the storyline. For example, sequences can tell us about growth within a particular society. It can tell us about growth about a particular person, maybe the mental growth or the social growth or the physical growth, okay? It can give us a kind of idea of how we can identify the Bildungsroman character. That is, the character we can trace from early childhood into the moment of adulthood, and the stories that happen in that person's transformation that give us a very important ideology or thematic preoccupation within the entire literature. So in other words, when we deal with structuralist criticism of literature, we are dealing with a group of signs, a group of codes that give us ideas of people, characterization, the society, even the time. If we want to talk about mood, for instance, in literature, we want to talk about particular consistencies of, let's say, for example, a kind of society that is always within, let's say, terrorist attacks, or you are talking about kidnappings, or you are talking about crimes of all sorts, you are going to be able to have certain codes whose literal meanings definitely are saying things that are not like you are going to for Christmas. Even if you are going for Christmas in that kind of novel, you know that that Christmas will be just a kind of interlude, that is a kind of break from the actual narrative you are reading. So what structuralists will do is to bring out the linguistic elements that will be in coordinates of maybe nominals or verbals, and then you may be looking at structures that move from phrase to the clause to the sentences, and you might be looking at the regularities or the irregularities of these things to make the deductive meanings. Now, let me talk about that. In structuralist criticism, we are not really concerned about inductive meanings. That is, you are reading to know, about the actual story as presented to you. No. Structuralist criticism is more concerned with deductive meanings. That is, meanings you form when you look at a particular trend and you come to a conclusion. That is what structuralist criticism succeeds to do for us. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to round off in the next lecture, but don't forget, like this YouTube channel, LSW, share it. I'm sure you won't be selfish, definitely. You probably happened on it or somebody invited you to it, but then the world is about correspondences, so to speak, okay? And please like it, share it, drop your questions, drop your views, feedback. We'll love that. Thank you very much.